Good evening. I'm Scott Rothkopf, the Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney. That's one of the very first times I've said that in front of a large group of people because I'm just 3 months into my job. Actually, today is my 3-month anniversary. So because I started November 1st, and I can't think of a better way to mark this occasion than to have Nancy Baker Cahill with us to deliver the 18th Walter Annenberg Lecture, and my first as director. The Annenberg Lecture features a distinguished artist who has made a significant contribution to American art and culture. Previous speakers include, I'm noticing that something is missing from these notes. You know, I said to Nancy something interesting. I said to Nancy, I'm gonna go off script for a minute, that it was quite funny when I asked to have these notes printed. I had to ask to have them printed because at the Whitney, you cannot print from your laptop to a printer. And I thought, how ironic that I'm going down to give a lecture about Nancy, and I couldn't print it well, but that's okay. I'm just going to keep going. You know, it's all about what she's going to have to say, not about what I'm going to have to say. But I would like, before I say anything further, to acknowledge that we are on Lenapehoking, the ancestral home of the Lenape people, and that at the Whitney Museum, we are very committed to honoring that past and the ongoing futures of Indigenous people in this place and beyond, and also to highlighting and showcasing their work in our collection and program. Now I will continue with the notes that may or may not be what I had intended to read. The Annenberg Lecture features a distinguished artist who has made a significant contribution to American art and culture. Previous speakers include Jean Quick-to-See Smith, Klaus Oldenburg, Kara Walker, Martha Rossler, and Julie Meritu, among others. The series was created in 2003 in honor of Ambassador Walter H. Annenberg and with the late Stephen Ames, an esteemed and beloved trustee of the Whitney Museum for many years and a friend of mine. I would particularly like to acknowledge Grow at Annenberg, especially Gregor, Regina, and Zoe Weingarten, as well as the Annenberg Foundation, the Annenberg family, including Steve's wife, Ann Ames, as well as Liz Kabler. Thank you so much for your support of the museum, and hi, Ann, if you're listening. It is my great privilege now to introduce Nancy Baker Cahill this evening as our honored artist for tonight's program. For those of you who are not familiar yet with Nancy's work, you will be by the end of this talk. She is an award-winning interdisciplinary artist whose hybrid practice spans research-based immersive experiences, video installations, and conceptual blockchain projects, and focuses on systemic power, consciousness, and the human body. She is a founder of and artistic director of Fourth Wall, a free AR public art platform exploring site interventions, resistance, and inclusive creative expression. I also want to mention and add to all of these topics that she's an incredible, ingenious, formal maker of things, that there's a touch in her work and color and pacing and ingenuity in terms of how she uses her tools, and you'll see a lot of that tonight as at the same time we talk about the very urgent issues her work addresses. The Whitney is currently, as I think all of you in this room know, exhibiting a project by Nancy that perfectly encapsulates many aspects of her project called Chento, which is this miraculous creature hovering over our 8th floor terrace. Chento is something you can see if you go upstairs, and I hope you all have, and if you haven't, please do, by downloading Nancy's app, and you can interact with it. It's our first interactive, immersive, monumental AR site-specific experience at the Whitney, although we have had other AR works here before by Tomiko Thiel and Alan Michelson. And for those of you who are not here present physically, you can find Chento on whitney.org at Artport, which is our home for commissioned net art projects now for nearly 25 years. Can you tell I'm making this up as I go? I told Nancy before I don't usually use notes. Apparently, I'm not breaking that tradition. In addition, I want to mention, in addition to Chento, my commitment as the director to showcasing digital art more broadly in our collection, in our program online, and even in forums like this. We have been so lucky for the last more than 20 years to have among us as a colleague, I'm looking right at her, Christiane Paul, our curator of digital art. And I think, as the applause reveal, Christiane is a very beloved and admired member of not just the Whitney community, but the entire field of digital art, and it has been a real goal of mine, first as chief curator and now as director, to shine a greater light on her work and the advocacy that she does for many of you in this room, or the audiences who care about digital art. And as a perfect example, I want to recognize just today, or tomorrow rather, we open the incredible show, Harold Cohen Aaron, which is the first exhibition from our collection to explore the first artist to use AI, artificial intelligence, in his work dating back to the early 1970s and conceived even in the late 1960s. And if you are able to see this show, you will see that we have many works made during Cohen's lifetime, as well as plotters creating new posthumous works of Harold Cohen, but not quite posthumous works of Aaron, and we could talk about that. That's a different lecture. We also have Peter Burr with us tonight. Peter, wave. We're going to congratulate Peter because he is the current Sunrise Sunset Artport Commission. And I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit off topic from Nancy, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the community of makers and the curators who have so supported their work, and to pledge to all of you that this will be part of my work too going forward at the Whitney. So I should have said, if I had actually printed the right thing, that this is the first Annenberg Lecture to feature the work of an artist working digitally like Nancy. So not only is it my first as director, I think far more important, this is a major milestone, I think, for the history of the Whitney, to finally give you and your work and your thoughts on this field the place that they so well deserve. So Nancy, we are very honored to have you with us this evening. I know you're gonna do something amazing because I've actually seen your talk and your slides in advance. Nancy will give us a speech, that sounds a little formal, a lecture, a program, and then we will come and have a conversation up here after that will be sort of brief and informal. And I just wanna thank you again for all you've given the Whitney. You've been such an amazing partner for us, and pushed us in so many ways, which we can talk about also during the conversation, to kind of think differently about our own museum practice and who our audiences are and might be. So with that, please join me in welcoming Nancy Baker Cahill.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you so much, Christiane, and thank you everyone who's here. So many of you showed up from New York on a very, very busy night. Some of you flew in from other cities, and I'm just so grateful and excited to talk to you tonight. So without further ado, let's make sure that this tech works. Hang on. Like the printer, I'm having a bit of an issue. There we go. Did I just press harder? Okay. Hello, hello. Okay, here we go. Many years ago, I began translating my graphite drawings into experimental drawings. Oh, raise the mic. Okay. Usually I'm told to keep it down. I began translating my graphite drawings into experimental drawings in virtual reality. My pulse quickened every time I donned the VR headset. I felt absolutely ecstatic drawing in 3 dimensions. My body was almost completely invisible, and I could only see the 2 wands I used to pull and twist marks in infinite space. And like my analog drawings, every line, every smudge was a discrete decision. Only in VR, these decisions were also sculptural, visible from every angle. As dimensional apparitions, they defied physics and the constraints of traditional materials. It felt like expanded consciousness, or what writer Zay Amsbury calls ontological vertigo. And for those of you that work in VR, I'm sure you agree. So with the zeal of a convert, I invited everyone I knew to walk through my drawings. Most feedback was positive, although I did have one viewer who told me with a huge grin afterward that my drawings made him feel dead. And I've never quite known what to do with that. But the visit that made the most indelible impression informs what I am partly here to address today. One visitor put on the headset, lingered a moment, and then took it off with tears in her eyes. And she said, I hate the future. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that maybe a lot of people feel that way about digital art and experience it that way. And in some cases, who could blame them? It's not as if it's been warmly embraced by the traditional art world, until now, thank you, Scott, despite the tremendous scholarship, research, and accomplishments of its earliest practitioners of almost 100 years ago into the present. And for those, by the way, who are curious about which works belong in what should be a shared pantheon, look no further than Christiane Paul. As Scott said, she has literally written the book on digital art, and it's now in its 4th edition. I highly recommend it. But beyond the art world, the future my visitor decried is no monolith. Futures appear deeply imperiled by multi-systemic and interlinked tragedies. Ecological overshoot, where humanity extracts resources beyond the Earth's ability to regenerate them, is well underway. Human-centered machine learning and disinformation have gone mainstream, just as an election looms that will determine the fate of American democracy. Mental health has been quantifiably degraded by social media. Discriminatory laws targeting queer and trans populations are rampant. Biometric surveillance in the name of convenience, things like facial recognition software and technologies, has been normalized, made profitable, and disproportionately affects the most vulnerable communities. Impacts of algorithmic bias range from exacerbating stereotypes to empowering the prison industrial complex. Genocidal wars continue to unfurl. Autocracies and white supremacy are ascendant. Scientists believe that last year was the hottest in 125,000 years. Economic asymmetries and greed at scale, exacerbated by the tech industry, have led to what economist Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism. And in America, more than half of the population no longer has the constitutional right to make reproductive decisions about their own bodies. So, it's against this cheery backdrop that I will argue for interruptive art events of all kinds, for the critical role that digital art can play with such widely used technologies, and share my own hybrid practice. I stubbornly believe art plays a crucial role in sense-making, in metabolizing what's difficult, in subverting hegemonic influence, in finding shared humanity, and in imagining more equitable futures. I also believe that new, often participatory models of public engagement will be essential moving forward, one of the great affordances of digital art. As my friend, the artist Mitchell Chan, who's with us tonight, recently wrote, "If art has a duty, it is to render visible the conditions in the world which are ubiquitous but otherwise invisible." We are embedded in systems, and systems are difficult to see, much less understand how they work through, in, and against each other. I believe new models of civic engagement have never been more essential. This will require ingenuity, imagination, and using technological tools in unexpected and unorthodox ways. I share the belief that for art to even briefly silence the increasing noise online and elsewhere, it requires what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls a heretical consciousness. I would characterize many of my peers making art with advanced technology as heretical, whether they're working today or helped build the foundations of contemporary digital art. Part of what makes it so exciting to work in this arena is to bear witness to the ways artists rarely accept tools or the systems they enable as they are. Using these tools to reveal invisible conditions is a gift, one that I wish were more foregrounded. Refusing to play along is essential. It's the domain of the weirdo, the misfit, the trickster, all monikers I aspire to. It was certainly how I felt as an art undergraduate, drawn to the strange bedfellows of drawing and video. I was as smitten with Kathy Kollwitz and Egon Schiele's drawings as I was with Nam June Paik's videos and Jenny Holzer's LED truisms. I never connected the two mediums until recently, when I considered, as many have before, Paleolithic cave paintings as a kind of pre-cinema. Drawings coupled with flickering light for storytelling have long prompted transcendent, embodied experiences, which seems to be a condition that humans actively seek. I'll be combining these practices at scale in an upcoming immersive film, which deploys layering and camouflage to invite audiences to seek in both the literal and philosophical sense through deep listening and perceiving. What undergirds almost everything I do now are the persistent influences of my young life: political theory, science fiction, civic responsibility, and agitative propaganda. The ways in which interdependent ecologies and systemic power work in and through the body animated me then, and especially animate me today. All of these ideas demand expression through a variety of artistic vectors. VR was my hybrid gateway drug, followed by augmented reality, then immersive video and AI, and I can no longer separate any of my mediums. They are all inextricably interlinked. That said, my practice is still rooted in the traditional act of drawing. Much of my work on paper becomes material for sculpture, years of drawings that I rip and tear to build sprawling, quasi-Baroque, site-specific installations. Ambiguity inheres in the torn pieces. They could just as easily be leaves as feathers. The energy and emotion of the original graphite drawings contain the sculpture's essential DNA. When they become 3D, I think of each piece as an evolved mark in space. I try to freeze, just for a moment, the same gestural energy of the 2D drawings in 3D. This series, entitled Slipstream, after the speculative fiction genre, characterized by the strange familiar and the familiar strange, provides the raw material for a majority of my immersive video projects. I also use photogrammetry of these sculptures to transform them into 3D digital objects. This process involves taking hundreds of photographs of the sculpture from all angles and using software to transform the 2D data into 3D data. So think of it as like a 3D photograph. By the way, for a fascinating history of photogrammetry that dates back to 1850, I highly recommend the Whitney Lecture, New Ways to See Digital Art Criticism Now. You can find it on the Whitney website, I'm sure. It's excellent. But the software I use is additive and subtractive. It applies material where it's invisible to my human eye and inexplicably excises other portions of the work. I love this translative process as it underscores different ways of perceiving, human and machine. I bring the mutated sculptures into my 3D software and then subject them to all manner of impossible physics and lighting. To me, this is the apotheosis of digital analog hybridity and offers me the most creative freedom to blend and play while troubling notions of universal truth, misinformation, and singular authorship. To create this series, I considered each video a chapter in a fictional book whose authorship is shared. In a few of the works, I collaborated with GPT-3, which I know dates me by a few years, describing both the contents of the imagined chapter and the visuals of the video. And I quickly learned that there is a true art to the prompt. But I was able to elicit at least a few poetic takes, and this was one of the examples I kept. The heretical also informed my decision in early 2018 to launch Fourth Wall, an augmented reality public art app. For those who are unfamiliar, augmented reality, or AR, is a digital layer of content superimposed on the physical world. If you've ever used a face filter on social media, you've used AR. Because it's invisible to the naked eye and requires the visual prosthesis of a mobile device or a tablet or in some rare cases a headset, AR can truly be anywhere. I was initially motivated to embrace AR for a number of reasons. First, I wasn't able to exhibit my VR drawings easily, and I was hoping for a more expansive set of responses than I feel dead and I hate the future. I was curious what collaboration with an unknown audience would look like. What would Donna Haraway's sympoiesis, or co-making, look like in practice? I wanted to be in conversation with strangers, with people who may or may not have experienced digital art, and invite them to create their own content and context for my VR drawings, which had been translated into AR. I also wanted to increase public access to art. I was no stranger to feeling excluded in the art world. I returned to my art practice late in life after having 3 children. Building an art community from scratch after a 15-year hiatus was difficult. In addition, working with formerly gang-involved people at Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles underscored how few opportunities are available in public art education and creative nurturing. This made me very impatient. I wanted to challenge assumptions about public art, about who decides what it is, where it goes, and why it matters. I believe the human imagination is a miracle to behold. In the early days of Fourth Wall, people from all over the globe placed my work in contexts from the hilarious to the poignant to the wildly inventive, and shared their captures online. It was one such moment that expanded the scope of the app and of my own practice. My dear friend, the artist Tanya Aganiga, is a border activist and was in Tijuana one day. She placed my hollow point AR drawing in the United States and pulled it through the border wall into Mexico, underscoring that art and ideas have no borders and cannot be contained. I'll play it for you now. This powerful intervention inspired Coordinates, a geolocation feature on Fourth Wall. It allowed me to share and host works by digital and non-digital artists in the exact locations and settings of their choosing, where their work would have the most resonance for them outside of any institution of permission. It has since become a curated portion of the app and has hosted innumerable artists' collaborations, exhibitions, and activations all over the globe. The simultaneity of the visible and invisible is one of the essential poetics of AR. Its slippery uncontainability between spaces, unbound by any laws of nature or prohibition. As such, it exists in a shared, quote, cultural thought space, a term Stanford law professor Titian Sasubre coined. AR is distinct in its ability to be both present and absent, to reveal what may have been erased, forgotten, or unimagined. This is what makes it both a subversive medium and one of memory. I suspect some of it involves the multisensory nature of the embodied experience of AR. One feels the texture of the ground underfoot, or smells the air, or listens to ambient sound as one experiences it. I'll share merely 2 examples of hundreds that powerfully illustrate this phenomenon in AR exhibitions I've co-curated and hosted. When I encounter a powerful AR work, for example, over the LA River as part of Defining Line, which I co-curated with artist Deborah Scacco in 2018, I can no longer walk that stretch of river without recalling its impact. In Filthy Water Cannot Be Washed, Andrea Chung wanted her critique of colonization to be cited over an invasive species of weeds in the river. The content of the work is unforgettable, embedded in my embodied experience and memory. The same is true in the Battlegrounds exhibition in New Orleans, which I co-curated with writer and curator Jesse Damiani in 2019. Chandra McCormick's Holy Family Spiritual Church is installed over an empty lot in the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans. It was critical to her to insist on remembering an essential community hub led by women long gone after Hurricane Katrina and increasing gentrification. Again, these are just 2 examples of hundreds I've been fortunate enough to host. I've also used Fourth Wall for my own guerrilla activations. In 2018, during Dr. Ford's testimony against now Justice Kavanaugh, I geolocated one of my graphite drawings from a series about embodied trauma in front of the Supreme Court, and added the word unprotected to signal that the ERA remains unratified and that more than half of the American citizenry remains unprotected equally under the Constitution. To install this work and countless others, I rely on on-the-ground collaborators to test the placement of the work. These bonds are as valuable as the work itself and stitch together a network of resistance and poetic interventions. After Roe was overturned, I updated Unprotected with state property to signal the fracturing not only of body autonomy, but also of human rights and democracy. I installed it over several state houses with the most barbaric laws that both criminalize healthcare and place people with uteruses in mortal danger. In both cases, a sense of democratic collapse fueled my anger and despair. First, over the mockery of sexual assault and what in 2018 looked rightly like the imminent overturning of Roe. And then, of course, more recently, over its actual overturning and all of the externalities it brought and will continue to bring. It felt like the only recourse I had beyond voting to protest patriarchal violence, court-sanctioned oppression, and ongoing legislative violations of human rights. AR allowed me to act quickly and nimbly, collaborating with allies across the country to create a digital, interruptive public performance and to realize a work that served as a beacon, I hope, to those who felt the same. In 2020, the Art Production Fund commissioned me to make Liberty Bell, a multi-city animated AR artwork. The work questioned what liberty even meant as a concept during an election year, but also historically. Of the founding principles of American democracy, the work asked, liberty from what, and liberty for whom? It was installed in multiple historically significant locations, including Selma, Philadelphia, Charleston, Boston, Washington, D.C., and New York, and its dissonant ringing as it strained, unspooled, and contracted felt appropriate to the moment. Here it is in Selma, home to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Curator Neville Wakefield first referred to my work as land art in a 2019 LA Times interview about my monumental AR installations at the Desert X Biennial. When I say monumental, I'm not being self-aggrandizing. I mean literally enormous. They are animated monuments. It might seem paradoxical to think of invisible digital works as land art, but I found that AR is uniquely successful as a medium when developing land art installations, and the reasons might surprise you. AR allows viewers to embed ideas in natural settings with minimal harm to local flora and fauna, and to embrace alternate modes of perceiving. At its best, traditional art confers a degree of awe and spectacle. Because of its scalability, AR artworks can induce wonder and transformative awe as they are often animated and integrated into a landscape. My two works for Desert X, one located over the Salton Sea and one over the Palm Springs wind farms, were inspired by Timothy Morton's book, Hyperobjects. They were intended to highlight two iterative considerations of the inconceivably complex externalities and entangled impacts of human-caused climate change. One welcome surprise of Desert X, which has played out time and time again since, was the way that people engaged with the work, whether by performing with it physically and becoming a part of the work in its storytelling. I always say they write themselves into the text of the work, or just connecting with strangers, having these impromptu conversations, these sudden communities that sprung up and then, of course, dissipated. And unlike, oh, hold on. This is margin of error. And unlike the male-dominated tradition of land art, which involved, and in some cases, of course, still involves, moving vast amounts of earth, AR interventions leave a minimal trace on site. The ephemeral plays a similar role in the feminist land art of Agnes Dean's iconic Wheatfield, A Confrontation, and Judy Chicago's Smoke and Firework performances, a lineage I revere. I do not mean to imply that the energy used to create the works, nor the vectors through which they are experienced, have no ecological impact. They do, as most manufactured technologies do, with a disproportionate impact unjustly absorbed by the global South. But given the ubiquity and influence of mobile devices in contemporary life, there's an opportunity to use these devices to upend neoliberal mythologies of progress, among other issues. A more recent AR land art project from 2023 is Lifelines, a work of ecological imagination commissioned by the City of Lancaster and the Museum of Art and History. The work is located in the Prime Desert Woodland Preserve, a protected historic desert in the Antelope Valley. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Also intended to challenge human exceptionalism, Lifelines dwarfs human visitors in the form of 3 colossal, breathing Joshua trees surrounded by a ghostly murmuration of birds. Joshua trees are imperiled in the Mojave Valley, and I wanted to underscore their majesty by having them breathe, rhythmically expanding and contracting. The climate crisis has damaged the ability of many local bird species to thrive and has disrupted their migratory patterns. This ongoing precarity offered an opportunity to reframe our interdependent relationship with this natural ecosystem and epistemologies erased or ignored by the quote-unquote progress of modernity. The Antelope Valley, like so many other regions, is also home to a tragic history of genocide. To move through the prime desert woodland is to encounter its enduring planetary intelligence above and below ground. It offers a rare glimpse into how a protected desert ecosystem might thrive when treated with care and respect. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer writes, "Paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world." Lifelines invites attention to the region's troubled past, imperiled present, and modes of inherited knowledge, which present the possibility of regenerative futures here and beyond. So here is Lifelines. Technologies, as many have said eloquently before, are never neutral and cannot be decoupled from the individuals, corporations, or governments that profit from their development, nor from the populations they inevitably serve or harm. The weaponization of such technologies is an ongoing source of interest to me. When thinking about climate change, I could think of no better symbol than the ultimate weapon of man-made cataclysm and ecocide, the mushroom cloud. Mushroom clouds have long gripped the minds of artists, including Bruce Conner and Tsai Guo-chang. I followed them with my own version in 2021. This AR land artwork was a tentacular, literally multi-nodal blockchain project. I wanted to underscore the destruction and fragility of all interdependent ecosystems and to signal human responsibility. This traumatic symbol speaks its own devastating language. I wanted to transform and restructure its visualization as an invitation to consider an alternative, life-generating model. As the radioactive cloud dissolves, another mushroom cloud appears in counterpoint, one that is otherwise hidden from view underground. What spreads across the sky is a mycelial network, the fungal colonies which form the connective tissue of all carbon-based life on Earth. These resilient and regenerative networks sustain life versus destroy it. Biomimetic models are an ongoing source of inspiration for me, as you'll see. Each interaction with the project represented a stage of engagement and participation in a newly imagined system of accountability. In collaboration with art attorney Sarah Conley Odenkirk, we deployed the transparent, contractual language of blockchain in a Web3-friendly network blueprint to frame value as ethical values. Collectors were invited to seed regenerative networks of care by gifting one or more of my analog node sculptures to a person or people to whom they were deeply connected. The idea was to grow a supportive network like mycelium based on self-repairing structures. By blanketing the sky with the poetics of interconnectedness, I hoped viewers might perceive a communal, often invisible cloud, one that privileges generosity and mutual accountability. Here's the artwork featured at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2022. I've expanded on these ideas in another project that looks to nature as a model. In this case, mycelium and mother trees. Substrate, still in progress and funded by the LACMA Art and Tech Lab, is an experimental systems project in futuristic civics. Our shared social, economic, and environmental futures may depend on learning from new blueprints that privilege the health and sustenance of an entire system over the needs of discrete individuals. Admittedly, this is highly unlikely in late capitalism. But emerging technologies that contain the structural capacity for similar systems, bear with me, including the distributed ledgers of blockchains and decentralized autonomous organizations, otherwise known as DAOs, may provide new models of redistributing and protecting cultural knowledge and culturally specific epistemologies. To make that more, to put that in more concrete terms, Starling Lab, for example, has used the unique affordances of blockchain's decentralized and cryptographic infrastructure to document and preserve war crimes in Ukraine, even as the Kremlin tried to scrub them from the internet. Use cases like Starling's or scientific research DAOs, which protect and share vital discoveries, are early, but obviously by no means solitary, steps toward generating more equitable futures and modeling new kinds of collective governance. Substrate summons the mother tree, civic hubs, and overlapping networks of an art museum, which is LACMA, a central library, LA Public Library, and California community colleges, in this case, Long Beach Community College. This community-determined exhibition and institutional interlocking is a test case for a new for a new model of cultural engagement, access, and provenance. I've long been interested in human-machine collaboration as it might be applied to a host of existential challenges. In 2022, I was commissioned to collaborate with Sophia the robot, a humanoid robot, to create an artwork. I wanted to imagine what a less extractive and capitalistic approach to machine learning might look like if applied productively toward fortifying versus destroying the biosphere, or improving the lives of citizens versus exploiting them. The result was Stone Speaks, a project whose title was inspired directly by James Bridle's Ways of Being. The project began with an exchange between me and Sophia on the subject of the climate crisis, and from there, I dreamed up a narrative AR artwork, which is to say, an animation with discrete chapters. Part of the challenge of public-facing work is often translating complex ideas into legible experiences that are inclusive of all viewers. In Stone Speaks, I wanted to create a short cinematic story that imagined a reverse Big Bang from which a planet like Earth was forged. As the planet rotates, its surface becomes increasingly polluted and turbulent. Eventually, machine learning and human intelligence collaborate in the service of the entire biosphere, and the planet transforms again, altered indelibly from its origins, but renewed and receptive to new growth. Here's Stone Speaks. So I realize, ooh, we don't want that to happen again. I realize that's optimistic, that's an optimistic take, but I feel that if we don't begin to imagine new models, they will certainly never materialize. And in much of my work, I find that the only way to counter my own anxiety about the inevitability of climate and social collapse is by diving into my ecological imagination. Theorist Rosie Braidotti asked a question in her essay for Anthropocene Feminism that continues to haunt and inspire me all at once. She asks, can an insurgent post-anthropocentrism come to the rescue of our species? In 2022, I attempted to address her question with another AR work, Corpus. Commissioned by the Berggruen Institute, my task was to create a future human for the Institute's What Will Life Become symposium. Corpus imagines a future of blended, embodied entanglement forgive me, between human, machine, and microbiome in the form of a towering, gender-ambiguous human AR figure. Scaled almost to the ceiling of the 5-story atrium of the Bradbury Building, I wanted again to underscore for viewers human smallness, to engender empathy for other species by experiencing what it might feel like to encounter a gigantic human form. Corpus appears transparent in places to underscore the fluid nature of realities we have evolved for evolutionary fitness. The soundscape is composed of a blend of heartbeats, fetal, human, whale, the cosmos, which is a recording of 2 black holes colliding, and an AI interpolation of all of them. I wanted to visualize the interconnected and embodied, I wanted to visualize interconnected, embodied, and embrained sources of intelligence, microbial, synthetic, and carbon-based in a single form. As a holobiont, which is an assemblage of different organisms behaving as a single entity, Corpus also echoed the idea of a body politic and the ideals of equity built into the surrounding architecture. In blending so many life-sustaining sources of encoding in one, I wanted to propose a new model for survival and position the body as a process versus as an object. This is Corpus. And you can see it from different angles, from the floor, from the second floor. All of this has led me to my most ambitious work to date, Chento, now on view here at the Whitney. Chento is a participatory AR project focused on a bioengineered future creature, an experimental living test for community building and adaptability in the face of the climate crisis, co-built by a global audience. Synthetic biology is now progressing from hypothetical to incarnate. Many of these experiments serve militaristic, capitalistic, or socially or environmentally controversial purposes. Separated from such extractive interests, the question Chento asks is, would a creature imagined as a collage of human, cephalopod, microbiome, avian, mycelial, marine species, and machine fulfill or even exceed basic evolutionary requirements? What traits will ensure survival, and could we find hope in a blended future creature? What would a bioethically produced transspeciated self look like, and how might it move through space? Could species egalitarianism exist in the body politic of a new hybrid creature? And how could humans contribute to co-building such a creature? And I won't keep you in suspense. It's through choosing and adding feathers to its body, all of which appear in real time. Each feather is endowed with a specific property that might ensure its survival. Metaphorically, with each added feather, Chento's evolutionary fitness increases. I titled the creature Chento in homage to the literary device of poetic collage. Chento serves as an ever-changing collage, both of species and of contributions from an expanding community of participants. And as you can see, Chento has changed dramatically from the moment it appeared in October, when its entire body was apparently fully feathered within the first week. And I'll just play it for a moment.
I saw someone put a feather in their own.
Oops, sorry. As new feathers are added, the earliest feathers fall away or digitally molt, so Chento is always changing moment to moment. Chento's morphing over time will underscore the necessity of collaborative action and materialize species biological inextricability. I've been humbled and inspired by the responses of people who've engaged with Chento, who've spent time deliberating thoughtfully over which feathers they chose and why. And although we don't collect user data, we haven't even gotten into surveillance, we won't in this talk, we are tracking which feathers are chosen most frequently and when to see if there's any corollary between the types of feathers selected and world events. My friend and collaborator, the artist Deborah Scacco, whom I mentioned earlier, after adding a feather, told me it felt like voting. I don't think I've ever been so excited by a piece of feedback in my life. I intend to expand upon this new co-building model in an upcoming AR public art project in West Hollywood focused on body autonomy, privacy rights, and voting rights. And Chento, by the way, doesn't only exist in the skies above the meatpacking district and off the 8th floor balcony. Chento also has a habitat. You can experience its habitat on the 6th floor balcony screen and, of course, on the Artport website. Chento's habitat is divided into 3 chambers. The first, where it rests and refuels. The second, where it metabolizes energy. And the third, where it prepares to take flight. You will likely recognize its nest as a Slipstream installation. And I'll just play a very short intro, and then if you're curious, you can check it out on your own. Sorry. Dreaming up and then building a world for Chento was one of the singular pleasures of this project, as it gave the creature even more agency and purpose in my mind. The sense of play I had throughout the process has been mirrored back in the interactions of visitors with the creature. Grown adults have performed with it, taking videos of themselves alternately cowering below, or dancing with, or patting it, or waving at it. I think we often underestimate the role that joy can play in art. Its liberating and deepening power, particularly when the work is addressing serious questions. AR's lasting memory remains strong here. For Cultured Magazine, Karina Kirsch wrote, "I keep going back to the Fourth Wall app, whether I'm sitting at home, riding the subway, or waiting for an appointment. Oddly, I find myself thinking about Chento's vulnerability, that it needs me, or maybe I need it. Chento calls for a caring commitment with our more than human kin, in the words of ecofeminist Donna Haraway." This sentiment has been echoed back to me by many people who have experienced the work on site, and so obviously I hope the same is true for you. So, digital art allows artists to critique, subvert, and demystify the technological and algorithmic tools that dominate contemporary life and fuel systemic inequities. It also liberates imagination in a way other media constrained by physics and certain types of materialities cannot. Why are these instruments, outputs, and artistic perspectives so often excluded from traditional art making? Robust ideas and surprising execution should be one metric for great art. The scale and entanglement of the crises underway will require new heretical models for public engagement and critical discourse. I am well aware that the notion of heresy arrives fraught with complex historical and contemporary baggage. I invoke it here in the spirit of rigorous criticality toward established human-centered doctrines that contain versus expand how we participate within planetary ecologies. It is well documented that the attention economy profits greatly from our algorithmically trained distraction, numbness, and inertia. We will need interruptive events and artwork that, as Santiago Zabala writes, appropriates us into itself, shocks us, overturns us, and sets up a world of its own into which we are drawn, as it were. I'm honored to be in the company of artists using these tools critically to experiment with and imagine new models. Perhaps, instead of hating the future, we should move bravely into it with inclusive hearts full of heresy. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Hi. We have to take a moment. I know some people have to go. There's an opening happening. That was amazing. Let's see, I'm going to try now, since my printed notes failed me, just some handwritten scribbles. Again, I'm going kind of against the grain of this this conversation and this event. But thank you so much, Nancy.
Thank you.
Just like kind of blown away. And I have so many questions and thoughts, and I should, if I look at my phone, it's not because I'm texting or anything. I'm doing a time check. I think we're good. We've got some time to chat. I would love, well, there's so many places I want to think about going, but maybe let's start a little bit, I think, for those people who are less from your field or this world, and I hope there are a broad spectrum of experiences represented in this room and listening to us online, and will continue to listen to us on YouTube or wherever they find us. Just to delve a little bit more, you talked about collaboration a lot in your work, your collaboration with machines, your collaboration with technologies. I wonder if you could talk a little about like human collaboration, and not just of your viewers, but how these things come into being. Obviously, in looking at your work, I imagine it requires many different forms of expertise, and that's true, of course, of many different kinds of art, including non-digital ones, going back for a very long time, hundreds, thousands of years even. But could you talk about how you make your projects, the kind of people you work with? Are there teams involved? Do you have to find specialists in all different things? How many things do you feel like you need to know how to do, if that's even the right way of putting it? Yeah. Just love to hear more about that process.
I am so happy that you asked that question. It's an excellent question. And I actually, way back when, delivered a TEDx talk that attempted to sort of demystify that myth of the singular sort of soul artist toiling in isolation, coming up with these amazing projects and ideas and execution. And I think we all, those of us who work as artists, understand that to realize anything at scale, collaboration is essential. And in my own practice, I am so fortunate to work with a very small but mighty team of practitioners, both to manage the app, the AR app, the AR projects, And in some cases, and certainly in this very ambitious film that you saw a still from, which is the one with the cave painting, it's a film that's coming to COSM in Los Angeles and Dallas, this film called Seek, an even bigger team, where I absolutely have to rely on the expertise of people who know a lot more than I do about certain softwares and certain applications of those softwares. I'm also extremely lucky to work with two sound collaborators that I've worked with for years, Ana Luisa Petrisco and Caleb Craig. And I obviously want to shout out my team, my AR team at Shaking Earth Digital. They make all of this possible. And so in terms of, what it's required from me, obviously, ideation, execution, I build almost everything in VR first, but the translative process I do require, and integrating things into an app, that is not my specialty, that is not my strength. And I've always said that, if I were a better coder, I would be a hacker, I wouldn't be an artist. So, but because the traditional work so informs and is so inextricably linked to the digital, they're very much fused. And I think ever since I started working this way and trying to work in less, because I don't have formal training, I've learned based on the ideas. So I have an idea, how do I realize that idea? And then I learn whatever I can, and if I hit a roadblock, that's when I ask for help. And so I've been really fortunate. I feel like I've had a fire hose of learning over the past decade, but certainly even more recently because I do love to get my hands on absolutely everything. And so it gives me a different type of literacy and also a different kind of appreciation for the incredible labor of this work. I think a lot of times there's an assumption that because it's digital, it's either easily rendered, or it's just you just press a bunch of buttons. And there is so much math, there is so much coding, there is...
No one I know would think that by looking at your work.
But,
those are people who are obviously like a little more comfortable with digital technologies think that.
Well, I think the people most comfortable with digital technologies would tell you that it's arguably, at least for me, it's more laborious than traditional work. So I'm, and I also think that collaboration goes well beyond just the execution of the work. It's in the process of sharing the work, getting feedback. I love working in these participatory models, but also, and that's sort of the inception of Fourth Wall, but also all of the ways in which we collaborate when we have conversation, when we share ideas, when we engage with each other and we listen deeply. Mm-hmm. I think that's another way that I think collaboration informs not just my practice, but I would argue any practice.
And I wonder, related to this, if you could talk about what's it like making work with technologies that are changing as fast as they have? And that's quite different, I think, than a lot of other examples in the history of art making. Obviously oil paint was invented at some point in history, and we know a lot about that. And the Netherlands are like, then acrylic is there in the 1960s, and people can try and use that. Or photographic processes like the invention of a Cibachrome, basically, that allows for a positive print in color. But those things are kind of spaced out. Yeah. And it's not like most people who learn how to paint, the kinds of paints they're using are changing every year or every 5 minutes. And so how have changing technologies, as you've engaged them, changed your work? And maybe this is a question for a lot of different kinds of digital artists, like this thing that is like, are you pushing it? Is it pushing you? Is this a new paradigm in the history of art making, or just something that feels potentially more sped up? I'd love to.
Oh, I definitely believe it's accelerated 100%. And I think there's something deeply reassuring about the fact that, when I go to get a 9B soft lead pencil, it's the same pencil. It's the same pencil as it was in 1970. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
That's not when I started drawing. I just want to be clear. But I will say that that's a great question. And even when I was talking about that piece, Let's Go, when I said GPT-3 dates me, it was 2 years ago at most, and now ChatGPT, GPT-4, a lot of these technologies that are being used, of course, are on this highly, highly accelerated path of development. And to me, and I will only speak for myself here, but I'm interested in that acceleration only insofar as it allows me to execute the ideas with more precision, with more ease, or with more conceptual inflection. But the ideas always come first. And so I think that as these technologies which are never uncomplicated, I think they all warrant some moment of scrutiny and experimentation and inquiry and interrogation. What are they being used for? How are they being abused? Where are the ways that we as artists can test them, can kick the tires, poke holes, push into corners that maybe others haven't, before just embracing them wholeheartedly? Now, if you do embrace them wholeheartedly, I'm not saying that in judgment. I tend to look at them, I think, with a certain criticality before, jumping into it.
And have you ever had an idea that you just like couldn't execute because almost that didn't exist? I mean, I've worked with the artist Jeff Koons, and it took him 20 years to make certain sculptures because the thing he saw in his brain, and these are physical objects, although he used many digital technologies to get there, no one could do them. And is that true in your practice? Or 10 years later, there's a technology, and you're like, now I can do the thing I once dreamed of.
Yes, 100%. I can give you a kind of micro example of that, which is there's something that happens with AR, and it certainly happened early on, where when you would, you'd hold up your phone and you'd be looking at an object, and the camera is always pulling the digital asset toward you. It's pulling the artwork toward you. So even if it were a monumental work, if there's a tree in front of you, it's going to show up as like a postage stamp, which immediately breaks the illusion, breaks that fourth wall, and it's sort of like, it's just like robbed of all of its power. And they've since adjusted that so that the camera can now read objects, and so if you actually design something at scale, it will be perceived in a kind of more traditional, or in a more in a way that our human gaze understands as navigating space. So it'll be behind an object versus in front of it, and then the scale will be there's an adjustment for scale. So that's one like micro example of an improvement I welcomed. I almost wept when it worked properly, because it's so annoying when you're trying to do something and it doesn't work that way. But I also would say that of course there are technologies that don't exist yet, and there are ideas that are impossible to realize at this moment. But again, I would always sort of wait. And then I also think that there's a lot to be said for the transformative power of just light in a room with like a certain type of architecture. Like, you can create transformative immersive experiences with very few things that are considered technologically advanced.
You just teed up you used the word scale several times, and that's one of the words I wrote and circled while I was looking at this lecture, because I've actually never seen your work in this way at this scale. And I became very struck by my experience of your work on tablets or phones, and how distinct that in fact is from, I happen to be sitting in the front row, so things look really big and really immersive, and that you were talking about monumentality, but often one still is encountering it, or my experience has been on quite small devices and screens. And how do you think about that? Is that ever like frustrating that the screen isn't bigger, or is this, and I've seen that you've done larger scale projections too, but it's interesting to me how in this case the documentation, if that's even the right word, of some of the projects does feel quite different, and the scale opens up in some way. And is there ever a time you wished that like the phone was like so big you couldn't hold it? I mean, that wouldn't be very easy when you're like at a protest somewhere, but how do you think about this scale idea of like this versus that?
That's also a fantastic question. I mean, it's very frustrating in sometimes to have it, or there's a glare, or there's you can barely see it, you can barely hear it. I remember one time a journalist, after experiencing the Desert X work, said to me, to your earlier question actually, I'm so frustrated because I wish I could just see it in front of me. And I had to sort of say to her, well, yes, that would be magic. That does not exist yet. I wish it did, but it doesn't. And without longing for some sort of Black Mirror future where we don't have, where the interface literally is, our retina, which I don't, by the way, long for at all, I think, it's one of those things that we have to navigate, and that unfortunately or fortunately, either way, or just this is just the way it is, so much of our lives is mediated by these little Black Mirrors, these little screens, and the ways in which we use them performatively. In the moment, you'll get maybe a fraction of the work, but then you'll have this archive, this memory of it after the fact, and or stored in your photographs or whatever, where you can either relive it or work with it. And part of the tradition of digital art, so much of the tradition is remixing and collage. And so I sort of feel like there's an open universe. But for now, having this kind of miniaturized vector or miniaturized portal through which to experience these things is, yes, frustrating, but I'm not sure that something like, even glasses, I'm not sure there are all kinds of dystopian horror. I could list them, and that I don't wish on anybody. But I think again, even just the introduction of an expanded consciousness, a different type of experience of reality or quote unquote reality, is what they afford.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to do a time check because I have so many more things to ask you, but not time to ask so many more. So I'm going to go to my last two. I was really struck by how, this kind of, there were these two, not distinct exactly, but sort of themes or leitmotifs running through this talk about, on the one hand, a kind of pessimism about technology and this desire to be critical and subversive and exposing and demystifying. I don't remember all the words exactly you used. And, that is something, a kind of language I'm very familiar with as a lapsed art historian before I became a manager person. Throughout the history of modernism, that's kind of what one expected if one subscribed to a certain idea about what modern art was and how it could be good, that it had this critical streak about capitalism, or late capitalism, as you put it, about these technologies that might enter our lives, or the way that people might be exploited by governments or companies. And at the same time, I think that there's been much less space for any kind of optimism. And it's interesting, I happen to have to write the foreword for the next biennial catalog, which is opening in 2024 in March, very soon. And I read the last 3 or 4. And if you'd read those forwards written by my predecessor, Adam Weinberg, you would have thought that the world was only going from bad to worse. Every one began, we now live in a time, it's like the pandemic, the worst time ever, or George Bush got elected, or there was a war in Iraq, or 9/11 happened. And I was like, oh my God, this could be an amazing opportunity. We might now be living in the best possible time that will ever happen in all of human history, because it's only going to get worse tomorrow and the next day. And I thought, I can't write this forward being about God, it's just the most polarized, the worst, the most depressing. And I was looking in your talk and listening for those moments of the joy, a different sense of discovery, the curiosity that maybe we haven't made enough space for in a kind of critical discourse around contemporary art. And I just would love to dwell on that for a second. I'm trying to end in some hokey Pollyanna way, but I was moved by that in the way you were kind of talking, and you get close to it and you pull away from it. And it's okay, you can come out as an optimistic human being in the face of all of these difficulties. But I think it's worth talking about in a place like the Whitney, where that isn't often where the conversation goes.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to come out as a closeted optimist with a streak of pessimism. I think there's a danger with technology of being a techno optimist, and I actually think it's been quite destructive as a force. So I think, and I also feel powerfully that the polycrisis, that these interlocking and entangled challenges can't be ignored. And in many ways, I think that's why I'm arguing, for me, it's very playful to be subversive. It's playful and joyful to challenge those things and to engage this idea of heresy, of going against what is expected, or in finding those little inroads. But I have to say that where I find joy and where I find optimism is in the ideas and the way that people engage with them. So I think that's been really obvious with Chento. When I see otherwise very serious adults, grinning and leaping on the balcony, chasing this creature that nobody else can see, that's delightful. And I think that it's no accident that there's been an increase in not just scholarship, but in the development of artwork that is executed through games. That games have become both very sobering in some cases, but also very playful ways, like Mitchell Chan, who was here, who I quoted earlier, has a brilliant blockchain project called Boys of Summer, which is a game that one plays, and in playing the game, which is really fun. I mean, it couldn't be more fun. You realize all the ways in which the system is stacked against you. So maybe that's just the flavor I love, a little fun with my despair. But yeah, I mean, I think showing up is optimism in this moment. I think making art is optimism in this moment. And so I'll embrace it unabashedly, but I will not for a moment ignore the fact that I think we are actually on a downward trajectory.
Okay, you and the author of every biennial catalog for the last 20 years. So let's be happy. It's never going to get any. Well, anyway, this will be the best it'll ever be. So let's enjoy this best possible moment for the rest of our lives. About Chento and the feathers, you obviously there's different attributes that people could select, and you have, I assume, some of the back end data about the selection process. And what do you think that it's telling us about how people either feel right now or care about this being? Are there any, I don't know, broad generalizations you would care to make about the attributes that people are most wanting to imbue the creature with?
Yeah, I wish I had. I actually printed it out, and I had the list, and of course I don't have it with me right now.
Me neither. I had it too.
But it's fascinating how many people have engaged with it, first of all, which is really, really heartening and really lives into the ideals of the project. But it is very interesting to me that the least chosen attributes are things like defense, are actually the things that I would have imagined more, not militaristic, but things that one thinks of as a kind of like when one wants to protect something vulnerable. And they were much more connected to, the most popular feathers have to do with communication and translation, if memory serves, and reparative rather. And one thing that was really fascinating, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was at a meeting the other day in Cambridge, and we were talking about Chento, and somebody in the meeting said, and I said, here's the thing. I really, to your earlier point, I really wanted Chento to be a little unnerving. I wanted to make people a little uncomfortable. I wanted people to look at it and feel like, that's pretty creepy. I'm not so sure about that. And instead, what the feedback I've gotten is that people find it really cute. Now, they might find it creepy, but they think it's cute, which was initially extremely disappointing to me. But I mentioned this to this woman, another artist, and she said, well, but it makes perfect sense that they think it's cute, because you're inviting them into an act of care. You're inviting them to care for it, to tend to it. And in doing that, they become invested in it in this way that it doesn't recoil from it. It leans into it and wants to be a part of it. And that was another surprise. And I think if there's one thing I might say is just that being open to those surprises, I think, is really important, and allowing the work to be the way it is and the way it's metabolized, without any sense of control.
Mm-hmm. That's great. It's been really interesting to watch people interacting with it too in real time here. And maybe I should there's time for one more question from me. Sorry. To end with, so as I said at the beginning, 18 of these lectures, and it took till now to have an artist working primarily, digitally be our Annenberg Lecture. And I'm so happy that you would be the first and inaugurating this moment and the start of my tenure. And I think it points to something that we can be optimistic about, or also pessimistic in some ways, is just the place of this kind of work in museums like the Whitney. And obviously it's been a tough road. I'm looking at Christiane, how hard she's had to work to create a space of recognition within our program and our collection, and with even in the general awareness of our staff and people in different departments that have to gain literacy beyond their, I'll go back to that word, expertise or comfort zone. And that's what art does. And I am so curious and hopeful as to where all this is going to go. But what do you feel about, and I should have acknowledged, had I printed the right introduction, you have a survey show right now at the Georgia Museum of Art. So you're steeped in museum at this moment, LACMA recently. What do you find about working with museums in 2022 or 2023 in the way that you work? And where do you see us going? And what do you want from us that we can do for artists like you or for the field? I'd love to hear that as I embark on my new journey.
Well, first of all, I obviously need to thank you for having the vision and the openness and willingness to be forward-thinking. And of course, Christiane, it's been one of the great highlights of my career to work with her, and to have when I got that email inviting me to do a project, it was, I nearly lost I think I froze in place. I was so delighted and excited, and having someone with her institutional knowledge, the breadth of her encyclopedic knowledge and expertise, and understanding of what is possible optimistically and also what's possible critically with this work is crucial. And when she said to me, having a museum, having an institution say, as she did to me, okay, well, I want you to do this thing, and maybe there could be an AR component. And when I said, oh yeah, definitely. And then she said, and maybe that AR component could have some sort of participatory, element to it. That's when I was like, oh, this is gonna be fun. And we worked collaboratively. Speaking of collaboration, we worked so closely and collaboratively together, and having her sort of shepherd the project while championing it, and of course being in discourse with you, it was just an incredibly positive experience. And the same is true of the Georgia Museum. And of course I'm working with a very young, exciting curator who was very open to connecting the dots between the analog and the digital. It was really important to her to trace, that's why it's called Through Lines, it turns out the Ruth Asawa show.
Same title.
But yeah, oops. To trace that lineage and also that entanglement felt really important. But I think, looking to other institutions and moving forward, I see and I feel a certain excitement and openness to these things in the future. I think what needs to catch up, if you will, is a certain rigorous digital infrastructure, literally, like actually having the hardware. And I again, not to be a techno fetishist, but like the means through which to present this work appropriately and in the ways in which it honors the work versus it dishonors the work, essentially. And of course, slowly but surely increasing digital literacy, not only obviously among the staff, but also in terms of public engagement. And I think that's critical no matter what. But, and this is my bias speaking, but because I think the future is interdisciplinary, maybe inviting programming or continuing to invite programming where different interlocutors and practitioners from different arenas can come together to discuss a lot of the issues, because I think we're in a moment of navigating difficult things. And what is more exciting than a group of very, very different brains concerned with a similar concern, in dialogue and in discourse. And I think that's one of the other great affordances of digital art, because it can be, because it is so multivalent, and there is no one singular way to do it. Mm-hmm. And there are infinite number of ways to do it. And I think particularly with the influence of machine learning and the ways in which that is truly revolutionizing all kinds of industries, that's going to be a really important part of the public facing. I'm not lecturing you or telling you what to do. I'm just saying, I think I'm speaking broadly to museum institutions generally, that's going to be of tremendous civic value. And I think of museums as these really important mother trees. So how to disseminate that information and share it and engage all kinds of diversity and plurality of voices around it seems really important.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I think it's a perfect place to end. Thank you.
Thank you.